I found my boyfriend on another woman's Instagram with the caption, "Finally dating someone who treats me right." He forgot one detail. He was still living in my apartment. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 31 years old, and until last Tuesday, I genuinely believed the biggest problem in my relationship was distance. Not the kind created by different cities or conflicting schedules, the kind that slowly develops when someone is physically beside you every day, but emotionally starts disappearing somewhere you can't reach. I had been with my boyfriend Mason for 3 years. For the last two, we lived together in a two-bedroom apartment that was leased entirely under my name. The security deposit came from my savings, the rent came out of my account every month, and every conversation with the leasing office somehow ended up being my responsibility. When Mason moved in, it felt temporary. His previous roommate situation had fallen apart, and he needed somewhere stable while he got back on his feet. At least that was the explanation at the time. I loved him, so saying yes felt easy. Looking back, most disasters don't begin with a dramatic betrayal. They start with a small compromise that seems harmless when you're making it. The apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable. It was close to my office, located in a safe neighborhood, and expensive enough that I had always taken budgeting seriously. Rent was around $1,850 a month, and I'd been covering all of it since Mason moved in. His contribution was supposed to be groceries and utilities. At first, he made an effort, or at least it looked like an effort. He'd come home carrying grocery bags and make a point of showing me everything he'd bought. But after a few months, those contributions became inconsistent. He'd forget to pay a bill. He'd order takeout instead of shopping. He'd promised to pick up household supplies next time, and somehow next time never arrived. I let it go for longer than I should have. Whenever I noticed the imbalance, I'd find a reason to excuse it. He was stressed. Work had been rough. Relationships weren't supposed to be scoreboards. The problem was that none of those explanations changed reality. Mason always seemed to have money for the things he personally enjoyed. New sneakers, weekend drinks with friends, expensive haircuts, random gadgets he insisted were investments. What he never seemed to have money for was the life we supposedly shared. I work as a project coordinator for a logistics company. It's not exciting enough to impress strangers at parties, but it pays well, and I've always been careful with money. Because of that, it took me longer than I'd like to admit to recognize what was happening. Looking back, Mason was never short on money. He simply chose not to spend it on the life we were building together. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It happened gradually over the course of months. Around 4 months before everything fell apart, I started noticing changes that were harder to explain away. Mason was still physically present. He still came home. He still kissed my forehead when he walked through the kitchen. From the outside, our relationship probably looked completely normal. But something felt different. His attention was somewhere else. His phone was suddenly attached to him at all times. If I entered a room, the screen tilted away. If a message arrived, he checked it immediately. Whenever I casually asked who he was talking to, the answer came a little too quickly. Every time I asked, the answer was the same: work. Then came the late nights. Mason managed a retail store that closed at 9, yet somehow he was regularly getting home close to midnight. When I asked about it the first time, he reacted as if I'd accused him of a crime. "Claire, seriously?" he said. "You're doing this now?" Doing what? Acting suspicious over nothing. I remember standing in the kitchen holding a glass of water while he took off his jacket and acted offended by the question. "I'm just wondering why you're home so late." "My job is stressful. Sometimes people go out after work. Not everything is some giant conspiracy." That word stuck with me. Conspiracy. The way he said it made me feel like my concern was irrational instead of reasonable. After that conversation, I stopped asking direct questions. Not because I trusted him more, but because I didn't want to become someone who spent her evenings checking phones and demanding explanations. I didn't want to beg for honesty from a man who should have been offering it freely. So I watched. I paid attention. And eventually the answer found me anyway. Last Tuesday, I was sitting in my car during lunch, picking out a grocery store salad and scrolling through Instagram when a mutual friend's activity brought a post onto my feed. The second I saw the photo, my stomach dropped. Mason was sitting in a restaurant with a woman I'd never seen before. His arm was around her. She was leaning against him, smiling directly at the camera. The caption read, "Finally dating someone who treats me right, 6 weeks and counting." I stared at the screen so long my phone dimmed. At first, my brain tried to reject what I was seeing. This was Mason, the same man whose laundry was still sitting in my dryer, the same man who had kissed my cheek before work that morning. The same man who had asked me to pick up paper towels on my way home. And according to that post, he'd been dating another woman for 6 weeks. Not talking. Not flirting. Dating. The part that hurt most wasn't even the cheating. It was how casually he'd done it. He hadn't hidden the relationship. He hadn't even bothered trying. He let another woman post him publicly while he was still living in my home, sleeping in my bed, eating food from my refrigerator, and building a second life behind my back. I sat in that parking lot for nearly 20 minutes trying to process it. The betrayal hurt, but the disrespect hit harder. Somehow the word finally bothered me most of all. It made it sound like I had been an obstacle he survived, instead of the person carrying most of the relationship for years. And as I sat there staring at that caption, something unexpected happened. I didn't get angry. I got calm. Very calm. The kind of calm that usually arrives right before a major decision. That night, Mason texted me that he was working late again. A week earlier, I probably would have questioned it. I would have asked where he was, who he was with, or what kept him out until midnight. Instead, I replied with a simple, okay. A few minutes later, I saw the typing indicator appear, then disappear, then appear again. Eventually, no message came. I think he was expecting a reaction. An argument. Questions. Something. What he got instead was silence. When I arrived home, the apartment felt strangely different, even though nothing had physically changed. The furniture was in the same place. The television sat where it always had. His shoes were still by the front door. But once you know someone is lying to you, ordinary things start looking different. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pulled up the lease agreement. The lease contained exactly one name, mine. For a while, I stared at the document without moving. Then I called a friend from college who specialized in tenant law. I didn't begin with the emotional details. I didn't mention Instagram. I didn't mention the other woman. I simply explained the facts. My boyfriend lives with me. He's not on the lease. He doesn't pay rent. I need to know my legal options. His response came immediately. How long has he lived there? About 2 years. He sighed. Then you need to do this properly. For the next 20 minutes, he walked me through everything. Written notice, documentation, no changing locks, no throwing belongings outside, no emotional decisions. Just legal procedures. The entire conversation felt strangely comforting. Not because I wanted revenge. Because for the first time since seeing that Instagram post, I felt like I had control over something. The cheating wasn't something I could undo. The lies weren't something I could erase. But I could decide what happened next. The following evening, I met my friend after work. We went through the paperwork together, line by line. He made sure everything was clean, professional, and impossible to challenge later. No accusations, no insults, no references to cheating. Just a formal notice stating that Mason had 30 days to vacate the property. Simple, legal, final. By Thursday evening, the envelope was sitting in my work bag. The entire drive home, I expected my nerves to get the better of me. They never did. If anything, I felt calmer with every mile. When I walked through the apartment door, Mason was actually home for once. He was stretched out on the couch, scrolling through his phone, completely absorbed in whatever conversation had his attention. He didn't even look up when I entered. That used to bother me. Now it simply confirmed what I already knew. I set my bag down, walked over, and handed him the envelope. He glanced at it casually. "What's this?" "Open it." His expression shifted slightly. Still unconcerned. Still confident. He tore it open and scanned the first few lines. Everything changed. The casual attitude disappeared. The color drained from his face. His phone slipped from his hand and landed beside him on the couch. "Claire." His eyes bounced between the notice and my face as he tried to process what he was reading. "What is this?" "It's a 30-day notice." His eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "I am." Even the traffic outside seemed distant for a second. Somewhere down the hall, a neighbor closed a door. Inside the apartment, it felt like the air had stopped moving. "We need to talk about this." "No," I said, "we really don't." His expression shifted from shock to panic. Then panic became calculation. That change happened fast enough to be noticeable. "Is this because of the Instagram post?" The question landed harder than he probably intended. Not because it surprised me. Because it confirmed everything. There was no confusion. No misunderstanding. No accidental overlap. He knew exactly what I'd seen. I folded my arms. "So you knew I might find it. Someone showed you, didn't they?" He stood up quickly. "Claire, listen, I can't explain." "I don't need an explanation." "You won't even let me talk?" I looked at him for a long moment. The strange thing was that I genuinely wanted an explanation a week earlier. I would have listened. I would have asked questions. I would have desperately searched for some version of reality that made sense. But after seeing that photo, something inside me had already moved on. Emotionally, I was still hurt, but practically, I'd already started thinking about what came next. You've been dating someone else for 6 weeks. His mouth opened, closed. No argument came, because there wasn't one. The evidence existed. The timeline existed. The post existed. All he could do was try to soften the impact. It's more complicated than that. I almost laughed. Every cheating story eventually arrives at that sentence. More complicated, as though additional details somehow transform betrayal into something reasonable. I looked around the apartment, the kitchen where we'd eaten dinner together hundreds of times, the living room where we'd spent holidays, the home I'd worked hard to build. Then I looked back at him. It doesn't seem complicated to me. His frustration appeared almost immediately. You're being cruel. No. My voice remained calm. I'm being done. That hit him harder than yelling would have. For years, Mason had learned how to navigate emotional conversations. He knew how to apologize. He knew how to redirect blame. He knew how to turn discussions into debates. What he didn't know how to handle was someone who had already made a decision. You'd really throw away 3 years over this? The question hurt. Not because it changed anything. Because there was a time when it would have worked. We had built a life together. Birthdays, holidays, routines, future plans. That's what made the betrayal so difficult to ignore. But every time I started feeling guilty, I remembered something. Those 3 years belonged to both of us. The last 6 weeks belonged entirely to him. You threw away those 3 years, I said quietly. I'm just asking you to pack. The tears came after that. Not immediately. Not dramatically. His voice cracked first. Then his eyes reddened. Then the apologies started. He said he'd made a mistake. He said he was confused. He said he never meant for things to get this far. What struck me most was that none of his explanations addressed the actual problem. Every apology focused on getting caught, not on what he'd done. Eventually, he admitted what really scared him. I don't have anywhere to go. There it was. The real fear. Not losing me. Losing stability. I looked at him. You have a girlfriend. His face tightened. We've only been together 6 weeks. I couldn't help it. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because the irony was impossible to ignore. He had apparently been confident enough to start another relationship while still living with me. But suddenly moving in with her felt too fast. Maybe that was something you should have thought about earlier. He flinched. The rest of the night followed the same pattern. Apologies. Promises. Memories. At one point, he even suggested couples therapy, as if therapy could somehow erase 6 weeks of deception. When he reached for my hand, I stepped back. That single movement seemed to affect him more than anything else. Because for the first time, he realized access to me was no longer automatic. Not my trust. Not my support. Not my home. Not my future. Later that night, I locked myself in the second bedroom and listened to him moving around the apartment. The 30-day notice had been delivered. The countdown had started. And for the first time since we'd met, Mason was facing a reality where he could no longer assume I'd be there to absorb the consequences of his choices. The next few days would prove that losing the relationship wasn't what frightened him most. What frightened him was losing the safety net he'd always expected to be there. The first few days after I served the notice were surprisingly quiet. Not peaceful, just quiet in the way a house feels when both people know something important has changed, but neither knows how to fix it. Mason stopped trying to convince me almost immediately. The emotional speeches disappeared. The promises slowed down. Even the constant apologies became less frequent. At first, I thought he had accepted reality. Later, I realized he was simply looking for another solution. He spent more time on his phone than ever. Conversations ended whenever I entered a room. Some evenings, he would sit in the living room texting for hours, barely acknowledging I existed. The difference was that I no longer cared who he was talking to. That chapter had already ended. What I did notice was how calm he seemed. Too calm. A man who had 30 days to find somewhere else to live should have been stressed. Mason looked like someone waiting for a backup plan to work out. I found out what that plan was a few days later. I came home from work expecting an empty apartment. Instead, I opened the door and heard voices. One of them belonged to Mason. The other belonged to a woman I'd never met. When I walked into the living room, a woman in her early 30s stood up from the couch. She was tall, stylish, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was in a stable relationship. The second she smiled at me, I knew exactly who she was. Or at least I knew enough. Mason immediately stood. Claire, you're home. The tension in his voice told me he hadn't expected me yet. No surprise there. Most of his recent problems seemed to begin when reality arrived earlier than expected. The woman extended her hand. Hi, I'm Jordan. I looked at her hand, but didn't take it. Not out of hostility. out of disbelief, because she clearly had no idea what was happening. Jordan glanced at Mason, then back at me. Mason forced a smile. "This is Claire. She's my roommate." The word hit me harder than I expected. Roommate. After everything we'd built together, that single word hit harder than I expected. Hundreds of ordinary moments that had once felt meaningful. Jordan's smile faded slightly. I could tell she sensed something was wrong. The problem was, she didn't know what. I looked directly at her. "I'm not his roommate." The room immediately became uncomfortable. Mason's face tightened. "Claire." "No." I kept my attention on Jordan. "I'm his girlfriend. We've lived together for 2 years." Jordan blinked in disbelief. She turned toward Mason. "What is she talking about?" Nobody answered. Or rather, Mason didn't answer. Because there wasn't a version of the story that worked anymore. I pulled out my phone. Mason took a step forward. "Claire, don't." That told Jordan everything before she even saw the screen. I opened Instagram and handed her the photo. The same photo that had changed everything for me. The restaurant. The caption. The 6 weeks. Jordan stared at it for several seconds. Then she looked at Mason. "You told me you were single." Mason rubbed the back of his neck. "It wasn't like that." Jordan laughed once. Not because she found anything funny. Because she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "It wasn't like what?" "Still nothing." "You told me your last relationship ended months ago." Mason tried speaking again. Jordan cut him off. "You said she was a roommate." The disappointment on her face somehow felt worse than anger. Anger can be explosive. Disappointment is quieter, more final. I recognized it because I'd felt it myself. Eventually, Jordan handed my phone back. She looked embarrassed. Not for herself. For believing him. I should go. Mason immediately followed her toward the door. "Jordan, wait." "No. Just let me explain." She stopped briefly, long enough to say one thing. "If you can lie this easily to her, why would I believe anything you tell me?" Then she walked away. The apartment door closed. And the second it did, Mason turned toward me. "You didn't have to do that." I stared at him. The statement was so ridiculous I almost thought I'd misheard it. "You introduced me as your roommate." I was trying to avoid a scene. The irony nearly made me laugh. He'd spent 6 weeks creating a scene. I had simply told the truth. For the rest of that evening, he alternated between frustration and self-pity. According to Mason, Jordan leaving wasn't entirely his fault. The situation was complicated. The timing was bad. He'd planned to explain everything eventually. The more he talked, the clearer something became. He still hadn't accepted responsibility. He was treating exposure like the problem instead of the deception that caused it. A few days later, I learned he was doing the same thing with other people. The first warning came from a coworker. She texted me during lunch. "Hey, is everything okay between you and Mason?" The question felt strange immediately. I asked why. Her response arrived a minute later. "He told some people you've been controlling and jealous." I sat there staring at the message. Not because I was shocked, because I was disappointed. Even after everything, he still needed a version of the story where he wasn't responsible. A few more texts followed. Apparently, he'd been telling people I monitored him, that I became possessive, that I couldn't handle him having female friends. The cheating never appeared in those stories. Funny how that part kept disappearing. Instead of arguing, I sent my coworker the screenshot from Instagram. A few minutes later, she replied, "Oh, then, yeah, he definitely left that part out." Exactly. He left out the only detail that mattered. By the time I got home that evening, I wasn't angry anymore. Mostly tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the rewriting. Tired of watching someone treat accountability like an unfair punishment. A few days later, Mason's mother called. For years, we'd gotten along well. She'd always been kind to me. That's probably why I answered. The conversation started politely enough. She asked how I was doing. Asked about work. Asked whether I'd been sleeping. Then, little by little, the real purpose of the call appeared. She wanted me to reconsider. Not the relationship. The eviction. According to her, Mason was struggling. He didn't know where he was going to live. He regretted everything. He missed me. I listened respectfully. Then I asked a simple question. "Did he tell you he was dating someone else?" The line went quiet. That told me she already knew. "He made mistakes," she said carefully. Mistakes. Plural. A surprisingly gentle word for what happened. He cheated. Another pause. Relationships are complicated. I'd heard that phrase several times by then. The funny thing was that this situation wasn't complicated at all. Painful? Absolutely. Messy? Definitely. Complicated? Not really. He started another relationship while still living with me. That part was straightforward. The rest was just fallout. Eventually, she asked where he was supposed to go. There it was. The real concern. The conversation was never really about what Mason had done. It was about where he was going to live afterward. I told her the truth. He had family, friends, options. What he didn't have anymore was the assumption that I would solve every problem he created. The conversation ended politely, but afterward I sat in the kitchen for a long time thinking about it. The more people learned what happened, the more obvious something became. Most of them weren't asking whether Mason had done something wrong. They were asking whether the consequences were too harsh. That distinction mattered, because nobody had forced him into this situation. Every problem he was dealing with traced back to a choice he'd made himself. The relationship was over. Jordan was gone. The move-out deadline was getting closer. And whether Mason admitted it or not, reality was finally catching up to him. The strange part was that things were about to get even worse. Because while he was still trying to manage the damage from one secret relationship, another woman was about to enter the story. And unlike Jordan, she had evidence. The next explosion happened on a Thursday morning. I was getting ready for work when someone started pounding on my front door hard enough to shake the frame. Not knocking, pounding. At first, I thought something was wrong. An emergency. A neighbor. Maybe building management. Before I could reach the door, Mason came rushing out of his room. The look on his face immediately told me he had an idea who it might be. When I opened the door, Jordan was standing there. She looked exhausted. Not angry in the dramatic sense. Exhausted in the way people look when they've spent hours realizing they've been lied to. In one hand, she held her phone. The second she saw Mason behind me, she didn't bother with greetings. She looked directly at him and asked, "Why is another woman messaging me saying she's been dating you too?" The entire apartment went quiet. Not because anyone was surprised, because the question itself answered half the mystery. Jordan stepped inside without waiting for permission. Mason looked like he wanted to disappear. "What are you talking about?" he asked. It was a terrible attempt. Even Jordan seemed offended by it. She unlocked her phone. "A woman named Erica contacted me last night." The reaction on Mason's face was immediate. His shoulders dropped. His expression changed. And just like that, every remaining doubt disappeared. Jordan noticed it too. "So you know exactly who she is." Mason rubbed his forehead. Neither of us needed an answer anymore. Jordan looked at me. "I'm sorry." The apology caught me off guard. "For what? For showing up like this?" I shook my head. "Trust me, you're not the problem here." That earned the first small smile I'd seen from her. Then she turned back toward Mason. She sent screenshots. Jordan handed me the phone. I started reading. The deeper I went, the worse it became. Erica hadn't been talking to Mason for 6 weeks. She'd been talking to him for almost 5 months. Longer than Jordan. Long enough that it overlapped with the period when I'd first started noticing something was wrong. I looked up. Jordan immediately understood my expression. "You saw it too." I nodded. At that point, the timeline stopped being messy and started becoming ridiculous. Jordan thought she was his girlfriend. Erica thought she was his girlfriend. I was still living with him and apparently serving as the invisible girlfriend neither of them knew about. What made the situation almost absurd was that Erica hadn't contacted Jordan to expose Mason. She contacted Jordan because she thought Jordan was the only other woman involved. She didn't even know I existed. Jordan laughed bitterly. When I told her about Claire, she thought I was joking. I couldn't blame her. If someone had described this situation to me a few months earlier, I would have thought it sounded exaggerated too. Mason finally sat down on the couch. For once, he wasn't arguing. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't trying to redirect blame. He simply looked exhausted, cornered, defeated. Jordan crossed her arms. "Do you have anything to say?" For several seconds, Mason stared at the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Smaller. I don't know. That was probably the most honest answer he'd given in weeks. Jordan shook her head. "I thought you made one terrible decision." She pointed toward the phone. Turns out this wasn't one decision. No one disagreed. Because she was right. This wasn't a single mistake. It was months of choices. Months of lies. Months of believing consequences were something that happened later. The problem with later is that eventually it arrives. Jordan looked at him for a long moment before turning toward me. "You deserve better." There was no bitterness in her voice. No competition. No resentment. Just honesty. Then she left. And this time, neither of us tried to stop her. After the door closed, Mason remained seated. For the first time in weeks, nobody was arguing. Eventually, he looked up. "I'll be gone by Friday." I nodded. "Okay." No argument followed. No negotiation. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. And somehow that made it feel more final than any of our previous fights. The next few days passed quietly. For the first time since everything started, Mason seemed to understand there was no fixing it. This time he wasn't making excuses. He was actually packing. The boxes that had been sitting empty in the hallway finally filled with clothes, books, electronics, and all the little pieces of a life he'd built inside my home. Every day another shelf emptied, another drawer cleared, Another reminder disappeared. Watching it happen felt strange. For weeks, I'd been focused on the betrayal. Now I was watching the physical evidence of our relationship disappear piece by piece. A coffee mug, a jacket, a stack of video games. The small routines that had once felt permanent suddenly looked temporary. Friday arrived faster than I expected. A rental truck pulled into the parking lot shortly after breakfast. Mason's father showed up first. I'd always liked him. He was a quiet man who rarely inserted himself into other people's problems. That day was no different. He shook my hand, asked how I was doing, and helped carry boxes downstairs. No excuses, no lectures, no attempts to convince me to change my mind. Just quiet disappointment. Mason's mother arrived later. The atmosphere immediately changed. She remained polite, but there was a distance between us that hadn't existed before. I understood why. Accepting consequences is often harder for family members than it is for the person facing them. By early afternoon, most of the apartment was empty. The last box disappeared through the front door. Mason walked back inside one final time. The living room looked larger than I remembered. Cleaner, quieter. He stood there for several seconds looking around, taking it all in. Eventually, his eyes found mine. I really did love you. A few months earlier, hearing those words would have destroyed me. Now they just made me sad. Because maybe he believed them. Maybe he didn't. Either way, love had never been the problem. Honesty was. Trust was. Respect was. Without those things, love becomes little more than a word people use after the damage is already done. I met his eyes. I know. For the first time in a long while, neither of us argued. Neither of us defended anything. The relationship had already said everything that needed saying. Mason nodded once. Then he walked out the door. The truck pulled away a few minutes later. And just like that, the chapter ended. The silence afterward felt unfamiliar. Not lonely. Just different. For the first time in years, the apartment belonged entirely to me again. The following weeks weren't perfect. Healing never works that way. There were still moments when memories appeared unexpectedly. A restaurant we'd visited, a movie we'd watched together, a song that came on while I was driving home from work. But every time I started questioning whether I'd been too harsh, I remembered something important. Mason was dealing with the consequences of his own decisions. I had simply stopped shielding him from them. Looking back, letting Mason face the consequences of his own choices was the best thing I ever did for myself.